The truck did not slow down before it hit the guardrail. It tore through the metal, spun twice across the wet asphalt, and came to rest nose down in the ditch beside Route 9. Headlights pointed straight up into the dark, like two searchlights calling for help nobody had sent yet. Laura Bennett heard about it before the ambulance even left the scene. The radio at the nurse's station crackled through the quiet of a slow Tuesday night at Millhaven General. The dispatcher's voice clipped and fast. Single vehicle, male driver, possible military passenger, chest and hip trauma, 11 minutes out. Crashes on Route 9 were not rare. The detour around the old bridge had pushed more traffic than the road could handle onto a stretch that was never built for speed. Laura had seen enough of these nights to know how they usually went. She did not expect this one to be different. Then the ambulance bay doors burst open, and everything in the room changed. The man on the stretcher wore dress blues, torn at one shoulder, soaked through at the collar, but unmistakable even under the fluorescent lights. A row of ribbons sat crooked across his chest. A medal, dented from the impact, swung loose on a chain around his neck. The paramedic pushing the gurney was talking fast, the way they always did when the call came in heavier than expected. Driver lost control on the curve near the old mill. No other vehicle involved. Patient was conscious at the scene, gave his name as Caleb Hart, said he was a Marine, said he'd just gotten back from his second tour. Vitals were stable, but the hip looked bad, possible fracture, and there was an old scar along his ribs that the paramedic figured was shrapnel. Dr. Amara Patel met them at the bay doors and took over without breaking stride, calling out orders, moving the team toward Trauma Room 2 like a current pulling everything along with it. Laura fell into step beside the gurney, doing what she had done 1,000 times before, checking the IV line, steadying the man's arm, speaking to him in the calm, even voice she used on every patient who came through those doors frightened and bleeding. He was younger than she expected, maybe 28, 29, dark hair cut close on the sides, a jaw that was doing its best to look brave, even as his hands shook against the rails of the gurney. When his eyes found hers, he managed a small, crooked smile, the kind people gave when they were trying to convince themselves, as much as anyone else, that they were going to be fine. "I'm okay," he said, his voice rough. "Just need to walk it off." "You're not walking anywhere tonight," Laura told him, and something in her tone made him laugh, a short, surprised sound that cracked into a wince halfway through. By the time they wheeled him into the trauma room, word had already started moving through the hospital the way it always did in a town the size of Millhaven, faster than anyone could explain how. A Marine, wounded in a crash on his way home from the airport. The story passed from one nurse to the next, picked up details with each retelling the way stories do, until by the time the night shift changed over, half the staff believed he had been driving home from his own welcome home ceremony. Nobody had organized one. Nobody needed to ask why a story like that spread so easily. People wanted it to be true. After 2 long, difficult years in town, after the mill closed and half of Main Street sat dark, after the funeral for Sergeant Owen Carter 18 months earlier had emptied out half the church in grief, Millhaven was hungry for something to be proud of. A soldier coming home alive was exactly the kind of story this town needed to hold on to. Laura did not think much about any of that while she worked. Her job was the body in front of her, not the rumors gathering in the hallway. She drew blood, checked his pupils, monitored the hip that the imaging confirmed was fractured but not displaced, the kind of injury that would heal clean with rest and time. She noted everything in his chart the way she noted everything, methodically, without judgment, the habits of 15 years in trauma care running on instinct, while her mind stayed 3 steps ahead, already thinking about pain management, about what the surgeon would say, about whether he had family to call. He gave a name, Caleb Hart, no address on file, no insurance card, nothing but a military ID that looked worn at the edges in a way that struck her, faintly, as practiced rather than earned. She filed the thought away without examining it. People lost wallets in car accidents. People came in with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a story about who they used to be before the crash took everything else. It was nearly midnight when Helen Carter walked into the waiting room. Laura recognized her immediately. Everyone in Millhaven did. Helen had been the kind of quiet, steady presence the town rallied around after her husband died overseas. The widow who showed up to every fundraiser, every memorial, every small gesture the community made to prove it had not forgotten Owen Carter's name. She had heard about the crash from a neighbor who heard it from someone at the diner who heard it from the dispatcher's cousin, And she had come, she said, because nobody should wake up alone in a hospital after serving their country. Laura watched her sit in the corner of the waiting room with her hands folded in her lap, waiting for news about a man she had never met, and felt something tighten quietly behind her ribs. Grief did strange things to people. It made them reach for anything that looked like meaning. The surgery to set the hip went smoothly. By 2 in the morning, Caleb Hart was resting in a recovery room on the 3rd floor, and Helen Carter was still in the waiting room, refusing to go home, telling the night receptionist she just wanted to see him once before she left, just to know he was real, just to know somebody's boy had made it back. Laura clocked out at 6, exhausted in the particular way that only a long trauma shift could produce, and told herself she would forget about the whole thing by the time she got home and slept. She did not forget. Something about the man in room 312 sat in the back of her mind the entire drive home, small and persistent, like a word on the tip of her tongue she could not quite place. She came back on shift 2 days later to find the hospital had become something close to a shrine. There were flowers in the hallway outside his room, a handwritten card from the elementary school down the street, decorated with crayon flags, a box of donated snacks from the diner, a folded blanket from the church quilting circle, a stack of letters from people Laura had never met, thanking him for his service in handwriting, that shook with the kind of emotion reserved for funerals and homecomings both. Someone had started a fundraising page online overnight. By the time Laura saw it on her phone during her break, it had already passed $4,000, climbing in real time as the comments filled with hearts and flags and thank yous from strangers, 2 states away who had somehow heard the story already. Caleb Hart, sitting up in bed with his hip in a brace, accepted all of it with the kind of humble, aw-shucks reluctance that made people love him even more. He told visitors he didn't deserve the fuss. He told the local paper, when a reporter named Holly Grant showed up with a notepad and a photographer, that he was just doing what any of his brothers in the Corps would have done. He told the children from the elementary school, who came by with their teacher to deliver their cards in person, that real heroes were the nurses and doctors who patched people up, not the soldiers who needed patching. It was, Laura thought, exactly the kind of thing a good man would say. It was also, though she did not let herself finish the thought that morning, exactly the kind of thing a smart man would say if he wanted people to keep believing him. She caught herself the moment the idea formed and pushed it away, embarrassed by her own suspicion. 15 years of trauma nursing had taught her to read bodies the way other people read faces. Every flinch and hesitation a small confession the patient didn't know they were making. It had also taught her, more than once, that grief and hope could make a town see exactly what it wanted to see, and that the line between a hero and a liar was sometimes nothing more than which story got told first and loudest. She told herself it was none of her business. She had a dozen other patients, a full shift ahead of her, and a town that badly wanted to believe in something good. There was no reason to go looking for cracks in a story everyone else had already decided to love. But 2 days later, while checking the dressing on his hip and helping him shift position in the bed, she watched him rotate his leg to get more comfortable, and something in the movement caught her attention, the way a wrong note catches a trained musician's ear, before the conscious mind even knows why. He did not flinch. A hip fracture less than a week old, barely held together by surgical hardware, rotated with almost no hesitation at all, no sharp intake of breath, no reflexive tightening through the leg, just smooth, easy movement, the kind that belonged to a body that had never actually been hurt that way before. Laura kept her face perfectly neutral, the way she had trained herself to do over 1,000 small moments just like this one, and finished adjusting his pillow as if nothing at all had changed. But something had, and she knew, even as she walked out of that room with her clipboard pressed against her chest and her pulse just slightly too fast, that she was not going to be able to let it go. Laura did not say anything that day. She told herself there were a dozen reasons a fracture might not hurt the way she expected. Pain tolerance varied wildly from patient to patient. Some people simply did not register pain the way the textbooks said they should, especially men who had spent years being trained not to show weakness in front of others. She wrote his lack of reaction off as exactly that, a side effect of military discipline, and moved on with her shift. But the next morning, while changing the dressing on the old scar along his ribs, the one the paramedic had assumed was shrapnel, she looked at it properly for the first time, really looked, the way she had been trained to look at every wound that came through her unit. It was not shrapnel scarring. She had treated enough combat injuries over the years, had read enough records and consulted with enough visiting military doctors to know what that kind of trauma left behind. Shrapnel wounds were irregular, scattered, the skin pulled in a dozen small directions by fragments that entered and tore as they went. This scar was a single clean line, the kind left by a surgical incision, faded with age, but unmistakable once she knew what she was looking at. An old gallbladder removal maybe, or an appendectomy. Ordinary, civilian, nothing that had ever seen a battlefield. She finished the dressing change without comment and walked straight to the records office, where she pulled up his admission paperwork under the pretense of checking insurance details. His military ID listed a unit designation she did not recognize, which on its own meant nothing, since she was not exactly an expert in the structure of Marine Corps battalions. But something about the format of the number nagged at her, and on her lunch break she did something she had never done before in 15 years of nursing. She looked it up. It took less than 10 minutes online to find that the unit number on his ID did not correspond to any active or recently deactivated Marine Corps unit she could find listed anywhere. It might have been a clerical error. It might have been a unit she simply did not know how to search for correctly. She was not a soldier, and she reminded herself of that fact several times as she sat in the break room with her sandwich going stale beside her keyboard, trying to talk herself out of the cold, steady feeling building in her chest. She thought about letting it go. She thought about it seriously, turning the idea over while she finished her shift, telling herself that even if something about his story did not add up perfectly, the man in room 312 was still injured, still recovering, still someone under her care who deserved her professional attention regardless of what she suspected about his past. Her job was medicine, not investigation. It was not her place to unravel a man's biography while his hip was still healing in a hospital bed. But that evening, scrolling through the fundraising page on her phone while she ate dinner alone in her small kitchen, she watched the total climb past $11,000, and she read through the comments, dozens of them, strangers offering not just money but job leads, free meals at local restaurants, an offer from a car dealership 2 towns over to replace his totaled truck once he was back on his feet. She read a comment from Helen Carter, posted publicly under her own name, that made Laura's stomach turn in a way she did not fully understand yet. Helen had written that meeting Caleb felt like a sign, that after Owen died she had stopped believing good things happened to people who deserved them, and that sitting with this stranger in his hospital room, listening to him talk about brotherhood and sacrifice, had given her back something she thought she had lost for good. She had written that she planned to visit again the next day, and the day after that, for as long as he would let her. Laura set her phone down on the counter and did not pick it back up for a long time. She thought about her own brother, Eli, the way she rarely let herself think about him during work hours because work required a kind of focus that grief did not allow. Eli had enlisted at 19, against their mother's wishes, certain in the particular way only 19-year-olds can be certain that nothing bad would ever happen to him. He had come home twice on leave, full of stories that made their whole family laugh until they cried. And then he had not come home a third time. Laura had been 23 when the 2 officers showed up at their mother's door, and she remembered with painful clarity the specific, sacred weight of what they were there to deliver. She remembered how careful those officers had been with every word, how much it had mattered, even in the worst moment of her family's life, that the truth was handled with respect. In the years since, Laura had watched, more than once, as people who had never served borrowed that weight for themselves. A man at a bar who claimed 3 tours to get a free round of drinks, a co-worker's cousin who wore a uniform to a Veterans Day parade despite never having enlisted, until someone who actually knew him called it out. Each time, something in her went quietly, coldly furious, a feeling she rarely let herself express because it was easier to walk away than to make a scene. But each time, she had also thought about the officers at her mother's door, about the actual cost behind the words people borrowed so casually, and she had promised herself, somewhere in the back of her mind, that if she ever had real proof, real evidence, she would not stay quiet. She did not have proof yet. She had a hip that did not flinch, and a scar that did not match a story, and a unit number she could not verify, which was not nothing, but was not enough either. So she decided, lying awake that night turning the problem over, that she would gather more before she said a word to anyone, especially not to Helen Carter, who deserved either the full truth or nothing at all, never a half-formed accusation that could be wrong. The next morning, she started paying closer attention. She noticed that the story changed in small ways depending on who he was telling it to. To the elementary school class, his Purple Heart had come from an ambush during a routine patrol. To the newspaper reporter, it had come from a roadside device that took out two of his closest friends and left him the only survivor. To an older veteran from the local VFW post who stopped by to shake his hand and ask which unit he had served with, his answer was vague in a way that made the older man's smile falter for just a moment, before he covered it with a polite nod and a story of his own. Laura watched that exchange from the doorway, pretending to check the chart mounted outside the room, and saw something she recognized instantly, because she had spent 15 years reading the small, honest signals bodies gave when words tried to lie. The veteran's posture had shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the particular stiffness of someone who had just noticed something wrong and decided, for reasons of his own, not to say so out loud. She caught him in the hallway afterward, on his way to the elevator, and asked, as casually as she could manage, what he thought of the young man in 312. The veteran, whose name she learned was Walter, paused for a long moment before answering. He said the young man seemed nice enough. He said it was a shame about his hip. And then, just as the elevator doors opened, he added, almost to himself, that something about the kid's answers didn't sit right. That real Marines talked about their units the way a person talked about their own family, specific and immediate and worn smooth from repetition, not vague and shifting depending on who was asking. He told her not to read too much into it. People process trauma differently, he said. Some men couldn't talk about their service in a straight line even years later, and that did not make their service any less real. He told her this kindly, the way an older man explains something to someone he assumes does not have the experience to understand it fully, and then he got into the elevator and the doors closed, and Laura stood alone in the hallway, with her certainty growing heavier by the minute. She decided that afternoon to check one more thing before she did anything else. His blood type was listed in his chart from the surgery, a standard part of any procedure that required transfusion as a precaution. His dog tags, which he wore even now, tucked under his hospital gown, were stamped with a blood type as well, the way every set of military identification tags carried that information for exactly the kind of emergency he had just survived. The two did not match. Laura sat with that fact for a long moment after she confirmed it, double-checking the surgical records against the stamped letters on the worn metal tags, making absolutely certain she had not made some careless mistake born of exhaustion or suspicion getting ahead of evidence. She had not. The chart said one type, the tag said another. It was not the kind of discrepancy that happened by accident, not for a man claiming years of active duty service, where that exact piece of information was drilled into a soldier's identity from their very first day of training. She thought about confronting him directly. She thought about it seriously, standing outside his room with her hand actually resting on the door, picturing how the conversation might go, how she might phrase the question in a way that gave him room to explain himself, if there really was some explanation she had not considered. But something held her back, a professional instinct sharpened by years of difficult conversations with difficult truths, telling her that a man capable of building a story this elaborate, this convincing, would have an answer ready for nearly anything she asked. He would deflect or charm his way past her doubt the way he had charmed an entire town, and she would lose whatever advantage her careful, quiet observation had given her. Instead, she went home that night and searched, for the first time, for a way to reach someone who could actually verify military service records, someone outside the hospital, outside the town, someone with no investment in the story Millhaven had already fallen in love with. She found a number for the regional office that handled inquiries related to military impersonation, a small department she had not even known existed until that search, staffed in part by investigators who worked alongside local law enforcement when a case crossed into criminal territory. She wrote the number down on a sticky note and folded it into her wallet, where it sat for 2 more days while she gathered her courage and finished one final piece of evidence she wanted in hand before she made the call. On the 3rd day, she asked him directly, in the gentlest, most ordinary tone she could manage, what part of the country he was originally from. It was a simple question, the kind a nurse asked dozens of patients every week, making small talk while she checked vitals and adjusted IV lines. He told her a town in the Midwest, a place he described with warm, specific detail, a grandmother's porch, a high school football field, a diner that made the best pie in 3 counties. It was a lovely answer. It was also, Laura noted, completely different from the small detail he had mentioned to Helen Carter 2 days earlier, when he had described growing up near the coast, learning to surf with his older brother before enlisting. She wrote both versions down in a small notebook she had started keeping in her bag, dated and timed, alongside the blood type discrepancy, and the scar that did not match the story, and the unit number that did not exist anywhere she could find it. By the end of that week, the notebook held 7 separate inconsistencies, each one small enough to explain away on its own, but together forming a shape she could no longer pretend not to see. She thought about Helen Carter, who had started bringing him home-cooked meals every evening after her shift at the diner ended, who had begun talking, quietly, to the hospital chaplain, about whether it was too soon to feel the way she was starting to feel about someone again. She thought about the children from the elementary school, who had started a letter-writing club in his honor, sending him a new card every few days, signed with hearts and tiny drawn flags. She thought about the fundraising total, now past $18,000, and the car dealership that had already delivered a replacement truck to the hospital parking lot with a bow on the hood, photographed for the local paper, with him smiling beside it on crutches. She thought, most of all, about the officers at her mother's door, and the particular, sacred care they had taken with the truth, and she understood, finally, sitting alone in her car in the hospital parking lot, with the sticky note unfolded in her hand, that she was not going to be able to keep gathering evidence forever. At some point, gathering became delaying, and delaying, she knew, was its own kind of choice. She dialed the number before she could talk herself out of it again. The call connected to a regional liaison office 2 hours away, and after being transferred twice and waiting on hold long enough to finish her cold coffee, she finally reached someone who introduced himself as Daniel Cross, an investigator who handled exactly this kind of inquiry, his voice calm and unhurried in a way that made her feel, for the first time in a week, that she was not simply imagining things. She told him everything: the hip that did not flinch, the scar that was surgical, not combat, the unit number that did not exist, the blood type that did not match the tags around his neck, the story that changed depending on the audience. She told him about the fundraiser, about Helen Carter, about the children's letters and the truck with the bow on the hood, and she heard, on the other end of the line, the particular shift in tone that told her he was no longer treating this as a routine call. Daniel asked her to send him everything she had documented. He asked her not to confront the patient directly, not yet, and not to discuss her suspicions with anyone else at the hospital, including hospital administration, until he had a chance to verify what she had found through official channels. He told her, in a voice that managed to be both gentle and serious at once, that she had done exactly the right thing by calling, and that cases like this were more common than most people realized, precisely because towns wanted so badly to believe in their own good stories that they stopped asking the questions that might unravel them. Laura thanked him and hung up the phone, and sat alone in the dark of her car for a long time afterward, feeling the strange, heavy mixture of relief and dread that came with finally setting something into motion she could not take back. Somewhere above her, on the 3rd floor of the hospital, the lights in room 312 were still on, and through the window she could just make out the shape of Helen Carter sitting beside the bed, laughing at something he had said, her whole face open and unguarded, in a way Laura had not seen since before her husband died. Laura started the engine and drove home, knowing that whatever came next would not be gentle, and that someone, very soon, was going to have their whole world come apart. Daniel Cross had handled enough of these cases over the years to know exactly where to start looking, and exactly how careful he needed to be while he looked. Cases involving stolen valor were strange in a way that most fraud cases were not, because the damage was not only financial. Money could be tracked, recovered, returned, the damage done to a town's trust, to a widow's reopened heart, to the memory of every real soldier whose sacrifice got cheapened by comparison. That kind of damage did not show up on any balance sheet, and it rarely healed as cleanly as a fractured hip. He started, as he always did, with the easiest thread to pull, a request through the Department of Defense's personnel record system for any service member named Caleb Hart, cross-referenced against the partial unit designation Laura had photographed from the ID card. The search came back within a day, and it came back exactly the way Daniel had expected it would after 15 years doing this work and developing an instinct for which stories held together and which ones did not. There was no Caleb Hart in the system matching the description provided. There were several men with that name who had served, scattered across different branches and different decades, but none of them matched the age, the physical description, or the supposed deployment history of the man recovering in a hospital bed in Millhaven. The unit designation on the ID card did not correspond to any real unit at all, not an error, not an outdated formatting style, simply a string of numbers and letters that someone had invented to look official to anyone who did not know better. Daniel sat with that information for a moment, the particular quiet satisfaction of a hunch confirmed mixing with the heavier weight of knowing what came next. A confirmed false identity meant the case had moved from a private suspicion into something he was obligated to act on, carefully, methodically, in a way that would hold up if it ever needed to. He drove to Millhaven himself 2 days later rather than handling the rest of the investigation by phone, in part because cases like this benefited from being seen in person, and in part because he wanted to meet the nurse, who had noticed what an entire town full of grateful, grieving people had missed. Laura met him in the hospital cafeteria during her lunch break, choosing the location deliberately because it kept their conversation looking ordinary to anyone who happened to glance their way. Daniel was younger than she expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of steady, watchful presence she associated with people who had spent years learning to read rooms before they spoke in them. He thanked her again for the call, told her the unit number had come back as fabricated, and asked her to walk him through everything else she had documented in person, slower this time, with no detail too small to mention. She told him about the scar, pulling up a photo she had taken during a dressing change, careful to frame it in a way that protected the patient's privacy, while still showing the surgical line clearly enough for Daniel to see exactly what she meant. She told him about the blood type discrepancy, about the shifting hometown story, about the way the older veteran named Walter had hesitated in the hallway, before deciding not to say what he was clearly thinking. Daniel listened to all of it without interrupting, taking notes in a small notebook of his own, and when she finished, he told her something that surprised her. This was not, he said, the first time he had investigated someone using a fabricated identity to claim military service. It was, however, one of the more elaborate versions he had encountered, both in the depth of the backstory and in how quickly it had been embraced by the surrounding community. Most cases like this unraveled fast, within days, because the person making the claim got caught in an obvious lie or panicked under direct questioning from someone who actually knew military protocol. This one had survived nearly 2 weeks, which told him the man in room 312 had done this before, or had at least planned this particular performance with unusual care. Daniel asked Laura one more question before they finished their conversation. He asked whether the man had access to any of his personal belongings from before the crash, anything recovered from the wrecked truck that might give them a lead on his actual identity. Laura checked and found that his belongings, what little there had been, were being held in a secure storage area near the hospital's security office, untouched since the night of the accident, waiting for a family member who had never come to claim them. Daniel obtained the appropriate authorization that afternoon to examine the contents, working alongside hospital security under Mr. Bishop, the hospital administrator, who had been read into the situation only enough to understand that a legitimate investigation was underway and that his discretion was essential to its success. The storage bin contained a duffel bag of mismatched clothing, none of it military issue, a cheap rental receipt for a costume shop 2 states away dated 3 weeks before the crash, and, tucked into an inner pocket, a second wallet entirely, one that had clearly been overlooked in the chaos of the emergency room intake. Inside that second wallet was a driver's license bearing a different name, a different birth date, and the same face. Derek Pruitt, 31 years old. An address in a town nearly 400 miles away that Daniel recognized immediately because it had come up before in a database search he had run years earlier on an unrelated case involving a man who had impersonated a fire department chaplain to collect donations after a flood, a case that had gone cold when the suspect disappeared before charges could be filed. Daniel stood in the small security office with the wallet in his gloved hands and felt the particular cold certainty that came with watching a pattern finally resolve into something solid enough to act on. This was not a man caught in a single moment of opportunistic lying after a car accident. This was a man with a method, refined over time, who had simply found, in Millhaven's grief and generosity, the most receptive audience he had encountered yet. He called in a colleague that evening, a local detective named Grace Lowell who handled fraud cases for the county, and who would need to be involved once the case moved from a military impersonation matter into broader criminal fraud territory, given the scale of the donations already collected. Grace arrived at the hospital just after dark, reviewed everything Daniel and Laura had gathered, and agreed that they had more than enough to act, but that timing mattered enormously now that they knew what kind of man they were dealing with. A man who had successfully run this exact kind of deception before, who had vanished the moment a previous scheme came close to unraveling, could not be given any warning before they were ready to move. If Derek Pruitt sensed even the smallest shift in how the hospital staff were treating him, Grace explained, there was a real risk he would attempt to discharge himself early and disappear before charges could be filed, taking whatever donations he could access with him. They agreed on a plan for the following morning. Daniel would coordinate with hospital administration to ensure Derek's discharge, scheduled for later that week anyway as his hip continued healing, would instead be moved up under careful supervision, framed to him as good medical news rather than the beginning of his unraveling. Grace would arrange for local police to be present but out of uniform, positioned discreetly enough not to alarm anyone, including the dozens of well-wishers who still stopped by the hospital daily with gifts and cards. Laura would continue her normal duties exactly as before, giving no outward sign that anything had changed, because Derek had spent 2 weeks studying every person around him closely enough to construct a convincing performance for each one, and the smallest break in her usual manner risked exposing the entire operation before it was ready. That night was the hardest one Laura had worked since the whole thing began. She walked into room 312 to check his vitals one final time before her shift ended, and found him in good spirits, laughing about something with Helen Carter, who had brought him a second helping of dinner from the diner and was sitting close beside the bed in a way that made the careful, professional part of Laura's mind ache with something close to grief on Helen's behalf. Derek thanked Laura warmly for everything she had done, told her she was the best nurse he had ever had the good fortune to be treated by, and asked, with what struck her now as a slightly too practiced smile, whether she thought he might be cleared to go home soon. He missed real food, he said. He missed sleeping in a bed that did not beep every few hours. Laura told him, in the same calm, even voice she used with every patient, that the doctors were pleased with his progress and that she expected good news within a few days. She watched his face for any flicker of suspicion, any sign that he sensed the shift coming, and found nothing but the same warm, grateful expression he had worn since the night he arrived. It was, she thought, walking out of that room for what she suspected might be the last ordinary conversation they would ever have, a genuinely remarkable performance. She understood, in a way she had not fully allowed herself to before, exactly how a man like this had managed to fool an entire town for 2 weeks. He was not clumsy or obviously dishonest. He was patient, attentive, and deeply convincing, the kind of liar who succeeded not through dramatic flourishes, but through small, consistent warmth, applied carefully to every person he met. The next morning arrived overcast and quiet, the kind of gray, still day that gave no hint of what was coming. Daniel and Grace arrived at the hospital before the early shift change, meeting briefly with Mr. Bishop in his office to finalize the details of how the discharge would proceed. 2 uniformed officers waited in an unmarked car in the parking lot, positioned where they could see the main entrance without being visible from the 3rd-floor windows. Laura started her shift as usual, and at 9 in the morning, Dr. Patel came by room 312 to deliver the news that Derek had been waiting 2 weeks to hear. His hip was healing well ahead of schedule. He was cleared for discharge that afternoon, with a follow-up appointment scheduled and a prescription for pain management on his way out. Derek's relief was immediate and, Laura noted with a small, uncomfortable twist in her stomach, entirely genuine-looking. He thanked Dr. Patel warmly, asked a few practical questions about activity restrictions, and began, almost immediately, talking about plans for the afternoon, mentioning a small gathering some of the town's veterans had organized at the VFW Hall to formally welcome him home once he was discharged, an event that had been planned for nearly a week and was set to draw a significant crowd given how attached the town had become to his story. It was Helen Carter, arriving just before noon with a bag of his things from the donated clothing drive, who first noticed something had shifted in the atmosphere of the floor. She mentioned it to Laura in the hallway, casual at first, the way people mention small oddities they have not yet decided to take seriously. There seemed to be more security around today, she said. More unfamiliar faces near the nurses' station, people who did not have the easy, practiced manner of hospital staff. Laura told her it was probably nothing, a scheduling thing, extra coverage for a busy discharge day, and watched Helen's face accept the explanation easily, the way a person accepts whatever answer lets them keep believing in something they badly want to be true. But Derek noticed too. Laura saw it happen from across the nurse's station, a small shift in his posture as he sat on the edge of his bed, waiting to be wheeled down for his final paperwork, his eyes tracking, almost imperceptibly, the unfamiliar faces moving through the hallway, with slightly too much purpose for ordinary hospital staff. It was a small thing. Most people would not have noticed it at all, but Laura had spent 2 weeks learning to read the precise language of his body, and she recognized, in the sudden stillness that came over him, the exact same instinct for danger that had likely saved him from being caught before, in whatever town he had run this scheme in last. He stood up too quickly for a man 2 weeks out from hip surgery, wincing for the first time Laura had seen him wince since the night of the accident, an unconscious tell that confirmed, even now, just how little that injury had ever actually cost him in pain. He told the nurse at his bedside, a younger colleague named Priya, that he needed some air, that he wanted to walk the hallway a bit before his discharge papers were ready, and Priya, having no reason to think anything of it, told him that was fine as long as he didn't go far. Laura watched him move down the hallway toward the stairwell instead of the elevator, slower than his usual pace but moving with clear, deliberate purpose, and felt her pulse spike with the sudden, sick certainty that he had decided not to wait for his official discharge after all. Laura did not hesitate. She reached for the phone at the nurse's station and dialed the security extension Mr. Bishop had given her that morning, her voice low and steady even as her hands betrayed her with a faint tremor. "He's heading for the east stairwell," she said. "He's moving fast for someone 2 weeks out from surgery." Daniel and Grace were already moving before she finished the sentence, having positioned themselves close enough to the floor to respond the moment anything shifted. Daniel reached the stairwell door seconds after Derek did, taking the steps 2 at a time, while Grace radioed the officers waiting in the parking lot to cover the building's exits in case he made it further than expected. Derek made it down 1 flight before Daniel caught up to him, calling his name, his real name, into the stairwell in a calm, clear voice that echoed off the concrete walls. Derek Pruitt. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Derek froze on the landing, one hand still gripping the railing, his face draining of the warm, easy color it had carried for 2 weeks straight. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then his shoulders dropped, just slightly, the particular collapse of a person who understands, all at once, that the performance has finally reached its end. He did not run, he did not argue. He simply stood there on the landing, breathing hard, the hip he had pretended to favor for 2 weeks now genuinely aching from the unaccustomed strain of moving too fast too soon. And when Daniel asked him to come back upstairs and answer some questions, he nodded once, quietly, and let himself be led back toward the room he had occupied for the past 2 weeks like a man walking toward something he had always known, somewhere underneath the performance, was eventually coming for him. Grace met them at the top of the stairwell with a calm, professional manner that gave nothing away to the staff and visitors moving through the hallway, careful to keep the situation contained until they were somewhere private. They walked him to a small conference room near the administrative offices rather than back to room 312, away from the curious eyes of patients and visitors who had no idea yet that anything unusual was happening. It was there, over the next 2 hours, that the full shape of who Derek Pruitt actually was began to come into focus. He answered Daniel and Grace's questions with a kind of exhausted, resigned honesty that surprised both of them. The energy of maintaining a constant performance finally drained out of him completely now that there was no longer any audience left to perform for. He confirmed his real name, his real age, his real hometown, none of which bore any resemblance to the warm, detailed stories he had told Helen Carter, or the elementary school children, or the reporter from the local paper. He had never served in any branch of the military. The surgical scar along his ribs was, as Laura had suspected, from a gallbladder removal years earlier, nothing more dramatic than a routine procedure that had simply turned out, by pure coincidence, to be useful cover for a story he had not even planned to tell until the moment paramedics found him in the wreckage and assumed, based on nothing more than his general appearance and the dress blues he had been wearing, that he was exactly who the uniform suggested. The dress blues, it turned out, had been purchased from a costume rental company 3 weeks before the crash, the same receipt Daniel had found tucked into the second wallet in the storage bin, Derek explained, with the flat, practiced ease of someone who had told this particular truth to investigators before, that he had been driving through Millhaven on his way to a different town entirely when the crash happened, and that the uniform in his bag, intended for an entirely different scheme he had been planning to run somewhere else, had simply become the most convenient story available once he woke up surrounded by paramedics already assuming the worst, or rather, the best, about who he must be. He had not planned, he insisted, to take it as far as he had. He claimed, though Grace noted this in her report with visible skepticism, that he had intended to correct the misunderstanding within the first day or two, before the fundraising page had even been created, but that the warmth of the town's response had been so immediate and overwhelming that turning back had started to feel, in some twisted way he struggled to fully explain even to himself, harder than simply continuing forward. Daniel had heard versions of this explanation before, the particular self-justifying logic of people who built lies large enough to eventually believe parts of them. He did not find it especially convincing, not after confirming, through a records search completed while Derek was still being questioned, that this was not, in fact, his first time running a strikingly similar scheme. 3 years earlier, in a town nearly 400 miles from Millhaven, a man matching Derek's exact description had spent 2 weeks posing as a volunteer fire department chaplain in the aftermath of a serious flood, collecting donations meant for displaced families, before disappearing, days before local police closed in on inconsistencies in his story. The case had gone cold, the donations never recovered, the chaplain never seen again under that name. A year before that, a similar pattern had emerged in a different state entirely, this time involving a fabricated identity as a search and rescue volunteer following a wildfire, a scheme that had collapsed only when a genuine search and rescue coordinator happened to recognize that none of the official rosters contained his name. Each scheme followed the same basic shape, a community in the middle of genuine crisis or grief, a fabricated identity built around exactly the kind of selfless service that community was primed to admire and reward. A careful, patient performance sustained just long enough to collect significant donations before slipping away ahead of any serious scrutiny. Millhaven, Daniel realized as the pattern assembled itself in front of him, was simply the first town where someone had caught the lie before Derek had the chance to disappear on his own terms. The conversation in the conference room lasted long past the time Derek had originally been scheduled for discharge, and outside, in the hallway, word had begun, inevitably, to spread. It started small, the way these things always did. A nurse, noticing the unfamiliar faces near the conference room. A visitor mentioning, in passing, that the soldier in 312 had been escorted somewhere by people who did not look like hospital staff. By early afternoon, the rumor had reached the VFW hall, where nearly 40 people had already gathered for the Welcome Home celebration that had been planned for over a week. Tables set with donated food, a banner stretched across the back wall reading, "Welcome Home Caleb," in careful, hand-painted letters that several of the elementary school children had worked on after school. Holly Grant, the reporter who had interviewed Derek during his first week in the hospital, arrived at the VFW hall to cover the celebration and found, instead, a room full of confused, increasingly anxious people, checking their phones for updates that nobody could quite confirm. She made a few calls of her own, the instincts that had made her a decent local reporter kicking in immediately, and within the hour had pieced together enough from a source inside the hospital to understand that something had gone seriously wrong with the story everyone in that room had spent 2 weeks falling in love with. Helen Carter heard the news from a phone call rather than in person, which Laura would later think was, in its own small way, a mercy, sparing her at least the added pain of receiving the worst news of her year while standing in a room full of well-wishers and donated casseroles. She arrived at the hospital within 20 minutes of getting the call, moving through the lobby with the particular urgent, disoriented energy of someone who had not yet had time to process what she was about to learn. Daniel met her in a private waiting room near the conference area, and Laura, standing nearby at his request because Helen had specifically asked for her, watched as he explained, as gently and clearly as the situation allowed, exactly who the man in room 312 actually was. Helen did not cry, not at first. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap exactly the way they had been the night of the crash, and asked only one question once Daniel finished explaining. She asked whether he had known, before any of it started, that she was a widow, whether he had picked her specifically because of what she had already lost, calculating, even in those first confused hours after the crash, that her particular grief made her exactly the kind of person who would offer him the warmth and trust he needed most. Nobody in that room had an answer that made the question easier to sit with. Laura stepped forward then, not because it was her job, not because anyone had asked her to, but because something in Helen's stillness reminded her painfully of her own mother in the days after the officers came to the door, the particular silence of a person trying to hold themselves together through sheer force of will. She sat down beside Helen, said nothing for a long moment, and then told her, quietly, that none of what she had felt over the past 2 weeks had been foolish. The kindness Helen had offered a stranger she believed needed it had been real, regardless of what the stranger turned out to be. That kindness belonged to Helen, not to him, and nothing he had lied about could take that back. Helen did cry then, finally, the kind of quiet, exhausted tears that come after holding too much together for too long, and Laura sat with her until she was ready to stand, saying nothing more, simply present in the way she had learned. Over 15 years of trauma care, that presence itself was sometimes the only thing that actually helped. By that evening, Derek Pruitt had been formally taken into custody, transported to the county facility, to await charges that would eventually include multiple counts of fraud, the unauthorized use of military honors, and additional charges related to the prior, unresolved cases Daniel's investigation had uncovered. The fundraising page, which had climbed past $22,000 by the time it was frozen, was flagged for review, with the platform's fraud team beginning the slow, complicated process of identifying donors and arranging refunds. The donated truck sat in the hospital parking lot overnight, the bow still tied to its hood, until the dealership arranged to have it quietly collected the next morning. The handwritten cards from the elementary school children remained taped to the wall outside room 312 for 2 more days, nobody quite willing to be the one to take them down, until a member of the cleaning staff finally removed them late one evening, folding each one carefully into a box rather than simply throwing them away, as though even now, even knowing the truth, the gesture behind them still deserved some small measure of care. Laura finished her shift that night well past midnight, the latest she had stayed in years, filling out the additional paperwork Daniel and Grace needed from her regarding the timeline of her observations. When she finally walked out to her car, the parking lot was nearly empty, the hospital quiet, in the particular hollow way buildings get after a long, difficult day finally winds down. She sat behind the wheel for a long time before starting the engine, thinking not about Derek Pruitt, whose fate now belonged to people whose job it was to handle exactly that kind of consequence, but about Helen Carter, sitting alone tonight, in a house that had been quiet for 18 months already, carrying a fresh wound, layered directly over an old one that had never fully closed. She thought about the elementary school children, who would need some gentle, careful explanation in the coming days about why the soldier they had written letters to was not, in fact, a soldier at all. She thought about Walter, the veteran from the VFW hall, who had trusted his own instincts in that hallway and chosen, out of politeness, not to act on them, and wondered whether he would carry some version of that regret for a while yet. And she thought, finally, about her brother Eli, and the particular sacred weight of what real service actually cost the people who gave it, and felt something settle in her chest that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but some difficult, necessary combination of both. The weeks that followed moved through Millhaven the way weather moves through a small town, impossible to ignore and impossible to rush. The local paper ran Holly Grant's full account of what had happened, careful and detailed, explaining how a hospital nurse's attention to a single detail had unraveled a story the entire community had embraced without question. The article did not frame Laura as a hero, and she was glad of that, because the last thing she wanted was to become a new version of the same kind of spotlight that had let Derek Pruitt operate so freely in the first place. She wanted, more than anything, for the story to simply be told accurately, and for that accuracy to matter more than anyone's feelings about how it made the town look. Not everyone took the news well. There was a strange, uncomfortable period in those first days where some people in town, having invested not just money but genuine emotional hope into the story of a wounded soldier coming home, found it easier to be angry at Laura for noticing than to sit with how thoroughly they had all been fooled. She heard, secondhand, that a few of the regulars at the diner had grumbled about a nurse who couldn't mind her own business, that someone had left an unsigned note in her mailbox suggesting she should have kept her suspicions to herself rather than embarrassing the town. She did not let it change anything about how she did her job, though she would be lying if she said the notes did not sting in the quiet hours after a long shift, when there was nothing left to distract her from the unfairness of being blamed for telling the truth. Most of the town, though, came around once the shock wore off, replaced by a kind of sober gratitude that took its time arriving but settled in deeply once it did. Walter, the veteran from the VFW hall, stopped by the hospital one afternoon specifically to find her, waiting patiently in the lobby until her shift break, and told her, with the particular formality older men of his generation reserved for things that mattered most, that he should have trusted his own instincts in that hallway, instead of talking himself out of them. He told her that real respect for the people who served meant being willing to ask hard questions when something did not add up, not simply accepting whatever story made everyone feel good in the moment. He shook her hand before he left, a firm, deliberate gesture, and told her that the next time the VFW post held an event, he would make sure she had a seat of honor, whether she wanted one or not. The fundraising platform, after several weeks of careful verification, managed to refund the vast majority of donations to the people who had given them, though a portion of the money, the part Derek had managed to withdraw before the account was frozen, was never recovered. Daniel told Laura, during a follow-up call to finalize her statement for the prosecution, that this was unfortunately typical in cases like this, that the money was rarely the primary thing investigators could promise to fix, and that the more important outcome was simply stopping the pattern before it could repeat itself in some other grieving, generous town further down the road. The case against Derek Pruitt moved through the legal system more slowly than anyone in Millhaven would have liked, the way these cases often do, complicated by the additional charges connected to the prior schemes in 2 other states. Laura was asked eventually to provide testimony regarding her observations, and she spent an uncomfortable afternoon in a courtroom describing, in careful clinical detail, the precise medical inconsistencies that had first raised her suspicion. She found herself, sitting in that witness chair, grateful for 15 years of practice translating complicated physical realities into language a room full of non-medical people could understand, because the moment called for exactly that kind of clarity. Derek did not look at her during her testimony. He sat at the defense table with his hands folded, the same hands that had once shaken convincingly against the rails of a hospital gurney, and stared at some fixed point on the table in front of him that never seemed to move. Laura found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not feel anger toward him in that courtroom, not the sharp, immediate anger she might have expected. What she felt instead was something closer to a tired, clear-eyed pity, the particular weariness that comes from recognizing a person who had clearly built an entire identity around taking advantage of exactly the kind of goodness most people considered automatic and unremarkable, never once seeming to understand what it might mean to actually earn that goodness honestly. He was ultimately convicted on the fraud charges connected to Millhaven, along with related charges from the 2 prior cases that Daniel's investigation had finally connected to the same pattern, and sentenced to a term in state prison long enough, Daniel assured her, to keep him from running this particular scheme again for a meaningful stretch of years, though nobody pretended it guaranteed he would never attempt something similar once he was eventually released. That uncertainty, Laura learned to accept, was simply part of how these cases ended. There was rarely a clean, satisfying conclusion that undid every piece of damage. There was only, at best, a stop placed firmly enough to matter, and a record kept carefully enough that the next town faced with a similar story might have an easier time recognizing the warning signs. Helen Carter took longer to find her footing again, though Laura made a point of checking in on her regularly in the months that followed, first through brief visits at the diner where Helen still worked, and later through a quiet, easy friendship that neither of them had particularly expected, but both seemed grateful for once it took root. Helen told her, several months after the trial concluded, that the hardest part had never actually been the lie itself. It had been realizing how badly she had wanted to believe something good could simply walk into her life without warning, the way Owen had walked into it years earlier, before either of them knew what the years ahead would eventually cost. She said she had spent 18 months convinced that kind of feeling was gone for good, and that Derek Pruitt, whatever else he had been, had at least proven to her that the feeling itself was not the problem. The problem had simply been who she let carry it. She started volunteering, not long after, with a regional organization that supported military families through the difficult early months after a deployment ended. Work, she said, gave her grief somewhere honest to go, somewhere it could be useful instead of simply heavy. Laura thought, Watching Helen describe the work with the first real warmth she had seen in her voice since before the crash, that this was perhaps the truest form of justice available in a situation like this one, not the prison sentence itself, important as that was, but the slow, deliberate process of someone reclaiming exactly the kind of goodness a liar had once tried to steal from her, and putting it back to work on her own terms. The elementary school children, once their teacher found a gentle way to explain what had happened, responded with a resilience that surprised most of the adults around them. Rather than feeling foolish about the letters they had written, several of the children asked whether they could write new letters instead, this time addressed simply to real soldiers and veterans they did not know personally, sent through a program the school set up specifically for that purpose. Their teacher told Laura, when she stopped by the school for an unrelated reason months later, that the children had ended up understanding something valuable from the whole experience, something about the difference between admiring an idea of bravery and actually honoring the real, specific people who lived it. Laura herself found that the weeks after the trial settled into something quieter than she expected, the particular flat calm that follows any period of sustained tension once the tension finally resolves. She went back to the ordinary rhythm of her work, the trauma cases and the long shifts and the small daily acts of care that had always made up the actual substance of her job, regardless of how briefly that job had intersected with something far more dramatic than the usual broken bones and car accidents that came through her unit. She thought, more often than she expected to, about the exact moment everything had changed, that small detail of a hip rotating too easily for an injury barely a week old. She thought about how close she had come to talking herself out of trusting that instinct, how easily the whole thing could have gone differently if she had decided, that first day, that it was none of her business, that the town's happiness mattered more than her own quiet, uncomfortable doubt. She did not think of herself as having done anything extraordinary. She had simply paid attention, the way her job had trained her to pay attention for 15 years, and had been willing, when it mattered, to trust what that attention told her, even when trusting it cost her something. On the 1-year anniversary of Eli's death, the date that had always sat heaviest on her calendar regardless of how many years passed, Laura drove out to the small military cemetery 2 towns over where he was buried, the way she did every year, and sat for a while on the grass beside his headstone, the way she always did, not saying much out loud, simply being present, the way presence had always seemed to matter most. This year, for the first time, she found herself thinking not just about Eli specifically, but about the particular weight every name on every headstone in that quiet field actually carried, the weight Derek Pruitt had tried to borrow for himself without ever understanding what it cost to earn it honestly. She thought about how easy it would have been for that weight to stay borrowed, how close an entire grieving, generous town had come to building a permanent monument to a lie, simply because the lie had arrived wearing exactly the uniform of grief they were already primed to honor. She left the cemetery that afternoon and drove, on something close to instinct, toward the VFW hall, where Walter had mentioned, weeks earlier, that the post was finally getting around to hosting the proper welcome home ceremony the town had originally planned, this time honoring 3 actual local veterans who had returned from deployment earlier that year, men and women whose service had simply never generated the same immediate, dramatic attention that a stranger's fabricated crash story had managed to attract in a matter of hours. The hall was warmer this time, Laura thought, standing near the back with a plate of food she had not particularly intended to eat, the celebration smaller and quieter than the one that had been planned for Derek Pruitt, but somehow more solid, built on something that did not need careful management to hold together under scrutiny. Walter found her near the refreshment table partway through the evening and thanked her again, more easily this time, for everything she had done, and told her that this particular gathering, modest as it was, felt like the kind of evening the town had actually owed its real veterans all along, regardless of how the previous attempt had gone. Helen was there too, helping serve food alongside several other volunteers from the family support organization she had joined, moving through the room with an ease and purpose Laura had not seen in her since before any of it started, since maybe even before Owen died at all. She caught Laura's eye across the room at one point and offered a small, genuine smile, the kind that did not need any words attached to it to communicate exactly what it meant. Laura smiled back and stayed a while longer than she had planned to, listening to one of the honored veterans, a quiet young woman named Marisol who had served 2 tours overseas, describe in plain, unembellished language exactly what her deployment had actually involved, the boredom and the fear and the specific, ordinary friendships that had carried her through both. There was no dramatic flourish to the story, no carefully calibrated detail designed to maximize sympathy or admiration. It was simply true, told by someone who had genuinely lived it, and Laura found that the plain, unpolished honesty of it moved her more deeply than anything Derek Pruitt's elaborate, practiced performance ever had. Driving home that night, the small town passing quietly by her windows, Laura thought about how strange it was that a lie convincing enough to fool an entire community for 2 weeks had ultimately done less lasting good than a single quiet evening built around the truth. She thought about her brother, about Helen, about Walter and Marisol, and the careful, ordinary work of actually earning the kind of respect Derek Pruitt had simply tried to take for free. She did not know, driving home that night, whether Millhaven would ever fully forget what had happened, or whether some quiet wariness would linger the next time a stranger's story arrived, wrapped in exactly the kind of uniform people were always eager to honor, without asking enough questions first. But she knew, with the same calm, steady certainty that had once made her trust a small, wrong detail in a hospital bed enough to follow it all the way through to the truth, that the town was better off knowing what it knew now than it had been believing what it had believed before. Some doors, once opened, could not be closed again the same way they had been before. Laura had learned, over 15 years of careful, attentive work, that this was not always a tragedy. Sometimes it was simply the cost of finally seeing things clearly, a cost worth paying every single time.